playfully told my hubby to hush with friends around, but he was deeply offended. Hi, I don't really know how to begin, but I feel like I have to say this, to get it all out and maybe, just maybe, understand myself better. And maybe in doing so, I can find a way to save my marriage. My name is Ellie, and I'm 34 years old. I've been married to my husband, James, for 8 years. We met in college, and he was the sweetest, kindest man I had ever met. James was the kind of person who would hold the door open for everyone, say thank you to the cashier, and pick up litter on the sidewalk just because it bothered him to see trash where it didn't belong. James was the quiet type who doesn't like being in the spotlight. He's happy to let others take the lead, and honestly, he seems to like being in the background, unnoticed and unbothered. Me, I'm the opposite. I love when people notice me. I love when they laugh at my jokes, when they tell me I look great, or when they say I did something amazing. I've always been like that. Even as a child, I wanted to be the one on stage at the school play or in front of the choir. I wanted to be the one everyone clapped for. James and I were different, but it worked. At least it seemed to work. I was the one who talked for both of us when we went to parties or family dinners. I was the one who made plans and decided where we'd go or what we'd do. He didn't seem to mind. He liked that I was outgoing, that I was loud and bold and full of life. He said I made things easier for him because he didn't have to worry about what to say or do. But here's the thing. Over the years, I started to realize something about myself. I wasn't just happy being the one who talked or made decisions. I liked being the one people noticed. I liked being the star. And sometimes to make myself look brighter, I would dim James's light. And believe me, it wasn't something I did on purpose at first. It started small. When we were with friends or family, I'd interrupt him when he was talking. Not because I had something important to say, but because I wanted the attention back on me. If he told a story about something that happened to him, I'd jump in and make it about me instead. People would laugh at my version of the story, and James would smile and let me take over. He never complained. He always looked at me like I was the most amazing person in the world. And I liked that. I liked being amazing. The more I did it, the easier it became. If James did something good, I'd find a way to take credit for it. If he had an idea at work that his boss loved, I'd tell our friends that I had helped him come up with it. If he cooked dinner and it turned out great, I'd make a big deal about how I'd taught him everything he knew. It wasn't just with our friends and family either. I did it when it was just the two of us. If he wanted to try something new, like taking a class or joining a club, I'd discourage him. I'd tell him it wasn't worth it or that he wouldn't enjoy it. And if he insisted on trying, I'd make little comments to remind him that he wasn't that great at it. The comments I made weren't mean or anything, just little remarks that were enough to make him doubt himself. He never got mad. He never told me to stop. He always smiled at me like he was proud of me, even when I wasn't being very kind to him. And because he never got mad, I told myself it was okay. I told myself it didn't hurt him. But deep down, I think I knew it did. One time, James got a promotion at work. It was a big deal. He had worked so hard for it, and he deserved it. When he told me, I was happy for him, but I also felt something else. I couldn't understand it at first, and I thought it was a justifiable emotion. But looking back now, I realized that I was just jealous. Isn't that awful? He was my husband, the man I loved, and I was jealous of him. I didn't want him to outshine me. So instead of celebrating him, I made a joke about how he finally listened to all my advice, and it paid off. Everyone laughed, and James smiled. But there was a friend of mine who looked at me with disagreeing eyes, as though she was telling me that I was going too far. And maybe I took the warning, because we were at a party sometime after, one of those casual get-togethers, with friends where everyone brings a dish and sits around talking. Someone asked James about a project he was working on, something he was really excited about. He started talking, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't interrupt him. I don't know why. Maybe I was tired, or maybe I took that stare from my friend very seriously. And to be honest, James was amazing. To hear him talk about something he loved was breathtaking. He talked about his project with so much passion and knowledge. Everyone was listening to him, really listening. They asked him questions, and he answered them so confidently. It was like he was shining, and for a moment I felt so proud of him. But then I felt that jealousy again, that horrible, ugly feeling that made me want to step in and take the attention back. So I did. I made a joke, something silly and harmless, just to shift the focus back to me. And it worked. Everyone laughed, and the conversation moved on. James didn't say anything. He just smiled at me, but it didn't reach his eyes. And now that I think about it, I keep asking myself why I needed to be the center of attention all the time, why it wasn't enough to just be with James, to love him and support him and let him shine. And I didn't like the answers I found. Thinking back, I can count so many times I stepped in and stole James's moment. The thing is, James never showed that he was upset, and maybe that's why I thought it didn't matter. He always smiled and let me have my way, which only encouraged me to keep doing it. Now, I see that just because he wasn't bothered on the surface didn't mean it didn't hurt him in ways I never stopped to consider. Why didn't I have all this clarity when I was being such a witch in his life? There was this one time when James had spent weeks building a birdhouse for the backyard. He was so excited about it. He had never been the type to build or repair things, but he wanted to try something new. Every weekend, he'd spend hours in the garage building the birdhouse. It took a few weeks because he was always busy with work during weekdays. When he finally finished, he was so proud. It was a beautiful birdhouse which he painted white, with little blue details, like something out of a storybook. When we had friends over for a barbecue, James brought them out to the yard to show off his handiwork. Everyone was complimenting him, saying how great it looked and asking how he made it. And I couldn't stand it. I don't even know why. It was just a birdhouse, for crying out loud. But I felt like I needed to insert myself into the moment, so I started talking about how I had helped him pick the design and the colors. I made it sound like the whole thing had been a team effort, when really the only thing I'd done was tell him it looked good when he asked my opinion. James just nodded along and smiled, like always. He didn't correct me or try to take the credit back. But later, when everyone was inside, I noticed him sitting quietly in the corner of the yard, looking at the birdhouse. I walked over and asked if he was okay, and he said he was just tired. I believed him at the time, but now I wonder if maybe he was more hurt than he let on. Another time, James had been practicing the guitar. He'd bought it some years ago, but had never really had time which he could commit to learning. One day, out of the blue, he decided to give it a real shot. He practiced every evening after work, and after a few months, he was actually pretty good. He even learned to play one of my favorite songs, and I was so touched when he played it for me. A few weeks later, we went to a friend's birthday party. Someone mentioned that there was a guitar in the corner of the room and asked if anyone knew how to play. James hesitated for a moment, and I knew he wanted to offer, but he wasn't sure if he'd be any good. Before he could say anything, I jumped in and said I knew how to play. Now, I did know a few chords from when I was a kid. I was in the choir, after all, but I was nowhere near as good as James. Still, I grabbed the guitar and played a couple of simple songs I remembered. Everyone clapped and laughed, and I basked in the attention. James didn't say a word. He just clapped along with everyone else and gave me that same quiet smile. Later, I overheard one of our friends ask him why he hadn't mentioned that he played too. He shrugged and said he was still learning, and the fact that I didn't feel a bit of guilt still shocks me to this day. I told myself that it wasn't a big deal, and that if he wanted to play that badly, he should have raised his hand once they asked. I know, my treachery knew no bounds, but it didn't stop there. There was the time we hosted a game night at our place. James had spent hours researching and setting up this elaborate trivia game. He was so excited to be the host and show everyone the questions he'd come up with. But as soon as the game started, I couldn't help myself. I kept chiming in, adding little jokes and comments, and eventually I took over as the host. Everyone loved it. They laughed at my jokes and said how much fun the game was, and I soaked it all in. James stood off to the side, letting me have the spotlight once again. When the night was over, I thanked him for putting everything together, and he just nodded and said he was glad everyone had a good time. I didn't stop to think about how he might have felt, seeing me take over something he'd worked so hard on. I could go on. There were so many little moments like that at dinners, at parties, even just at home. James would start to tell a story, and I'd interrupt to tell it my way. If he achieved something at work, I'd find a way to make it about how I had helped or inspired him. If he tried to take up a new hobby, I'd subtly discourage him or joke about how it wasn't really his thing. And through it all, James never got upset. He never told me to stop or acted like he was hurt. He just let me shine over and over again. I told myself it was because he didn't mind, because he was happy to let me have the spotlight. But now, I wonder if it was just easier for him to let me take over than to try to fight for space in our relationship. Looking back, I can see how unfair I was to him. He deserved to have his moments, to be proud of his accomplishments and talents, without me stepping in and taking the credit or the attention. But I was so focused on myself, on being seen and admired, that I didn't stop to think about what he needed. But of course not. I just had to be the most terrible wife that has ever walked the earth. There's one moment that stands out in my mind more than most, and even thinking about it now makes me feel awful. It was about 2 years ago, around the time of James's mother's birthday. His mom, Caroline, is one of the sweetest women I've ever met. She's warm, patient, and soft-spoken, just like James. She's the type of person who remembers everyone's birthdays, anniversaries, and even little milestones like the day we got our first pet. James is very close to her. He doesn't call her every day or anything like that, but he quietly cares for her in a way that's so gentle and unspoken. He would go over to her house to fix things when she needed help, call to check on her after a big storm, and always made a point to see her for Sunday dinners when we could. That year, Caroline's birthday was coming up, and James mentioned it to me about a week before. He reminded me that we should get her something special, something thoughtful. He even suggested a gift, an elegant tea set she had once admired at a shop near our house. She loved tea, and James knew how much she'd like to have something like that. I nodded along when he told me and said I'd handle it, brushing it off as no big deal. Honestly, I didn't even think about it after that. It wasn't that I didn't care about Caroline or her birthday. It was just one of those things that felt less important to me at the time. I was busy with work, planning a brunch with my friends, and prepping for a dinner party we were hosting later that month. Buying a gift for my mother-in-law simply didn't make the cut on my priority list. A few days passed, and James reminded me again. He asked if I'd gotten the tea set yet, or if I needed him to stop by the shop to pick it up. I waved him off and said I'd get to it. I could tell he wanted to push more, but James never liked to nag, so he dropped it. The day of Caroline's birthday came, and it hit me like a bullet train going at top speed. I had completely forgotten to buy the gift. It wasn't like I'd forgotten her birthday entirely. I just hadn't done the one thing James had asked me to do. I could see him getting ready in the morning, calm and collected as usual, and I felt a rush of panic. I was already coming up with excuses in my head, planning how I'd explain myself and promise to make it up to her later. But then, as we were about to leave, James handed me a beautifully wrapped gift box. For a second, I didn't understand what it was. He told me he'd picked up the tea set the day before, just in case I'd forgotten. He wasn't upset or annoyed. He was just his usual thoughtful self, quietly solving the problem without making a fuss. I felt a mix of relief and guilt. He had reminded me multiple times, and I had brushed him off every time. And yet, he had still gone out of his way to make sure his mom had something special for her birthday. We got to the party, and Caroline was so happy to see us. She greeted us with hugs and thanked us for coming. When it was time for her to open the gifts, James handed her the box. She opened it and gasped, her eyes lighting up when she saw the tea set. She was so thrilled, going on and on about how beautiful it was and how thoughtful it was for us to remember something she had mentioned so long ago. And then, without even thinking, I did it again. I smiled and said how glad I was that she liked it, and I told her how I'd remembered her admiring it that day in the shop. I even added a little story about how I'd gone back and forth on the color, before finally settling on the one I thought she'd love most. Everyone at the party chimed in, saying how thoughtful I was and how lucky James was to have such a caring wife. And James? He just smiled. That quiet, knowing smile of his, the one that never quite reached his eyes. He didn't say a word. He let me take the credit. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just a small thing. The gift was from both of us anyway, so it wasn't like I was lying. But deep down, I knew better. I knew James was the one who had remembered, the one who had gone out of his way to make sure his mom felt special. And instead of giving him the credit he deserved, I made it all about me. That night, after the party, James didn't bring it up. He didn't say anything about how I had taken over the moment, or how I'd made myself the star once again. He just hugged me goodnight and thanked me for coming to the party with him. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, quiet and kind, while everyone praised me for something I didn't even do. It wasn't the first time I'd done something like that, and I'm ashamed to say it wasn't the last. The worst part is, James never let on if it bothered him. He always acted like it was fine, like he didn't mind stepping back and letting me take the spotlight. And maybe he really didn't mind, at least not in the way I thought. But looking back, I can't help but wonder if I slowly chipped away at something in him, piece by piece, every time I did things like that. I wish I could go back and do things differently. I wish I could have handed that box to Caroline and told her that James picked the tea set out just for her. I wish I could have seen then what I see now, that every time I took the credit for something James had done, I wasn't just taking the spotlight. I was taking something away from him, something he deserved. And the worst part is, he let me, because that's just who James is. I guess I had no idea that I was digging my own grave, because one evening, not too long ago, I finally reached my limit with James, and the whole evening keeps replaying in my mind. I know why that moment sticks out more than others. It's because for the first time, James didn't just smile and let it go. For the first time, I saw something shift in him, and it scared me in a way I didn't understand at the time. We had invited a few friends over for a casual get-together. Nothing fancy, just some drinks, snacks, and a chance to unwind after a long week. James and I had divided the preparations like we usually did. I took care of the main appetizers and drinks, and James said he'd handle a cheese platter. He'd recently gotten into cheese, of all things. It had started with a random documentary he watched one night, and before I knew it, he was ordering all kinds of fancy cheeses online and reading about pairing them with different wines and crackers. I thought it was cute at first. It was one of those quirky James-like hobbies that he threw himself into quietly, but with so much focus. I didn't really understand the appeal, but I didn't mind it either. If anything, I liked telling people about it. "Oh, James is into cheese now," I'd say with a laugh, like it was a silly little thing he was doing for my amusement. That evening, when our friends arrived, James brought out the cheese platter. I have to admit, it was impressive. He had arranged everything so neatly, with little labels for each cheese and tiny bowls of nuts and fruit to go with them. It looked like something you'd see in a magazine. As everyone settled in and started picking at the platter, James began explaining the cheeses. He was in his element, talking about the creamy brie from France, the sharp cheddar from England, and even some fancy blue cheese he'd found at a local market. He explained how he'd chosen each one, what made them special, and which crackers paired best with each. The thing is, it wasn't just the cheese. James has this way of talking when he's passionate about something. It's slow and deliberate, and he goes into a lot of detail. To me, it can feel long-winded, especially in a social setting. I was sitting there listening to him go on and on about milk types and aging processes, and I felt myself getting restless. I could see our friends smiling politely, but I thought they were just humoring him. So I interrupted him. I said, "Hush, cheese expert, we get it. Let us just enjoy the food, okay?" I laughed as I said it, making sure it came off as playful and light. Everyone else laughed too, and I felt a little rush of satisfaction, like I'd saved the moment from getting too boring. But then I looked at James. He wasn't laughing. His face twisted in a way I'd never really seen before, his brows furrowed, and his mouth tightened into a frown. For a second he looked like he might say something back, but I didn't expect him to. I expected him to smile, shake his head slightly, and say something that'll take the tension away. But he suddenly scolded me, telling me that I should never disrespect him ever again in public. The room went silent. I was so shocked that I couldn't speak. The room stayed tense for quite some time before one of our friends said something about grabbing more drinks to ease the atmosphere. I was stunned to the bone, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured he was just embarrassed, but I assumed he'd get over it. The next morning, I noticed James was quieter than usual. I tried to talk to him, but he didn't reply, but it wasn't just that. There was a heaviness in the air, like something unspoken was hanging between us. I asked if everything was okay, and he didn't give me an answer. I let it go, thinking it was nothing. but things started to change after that night. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just small shifts that I didn't notice right away. James stopped talking about his cheese hobby. He packed up his books and the little tools he'd bought and put them away in the pantry. He didn't mention it, and I didn't ask. I assumed he'd lost interest, as he sometimes did with hobbies, but now I wonder if I took that away from him. He also stopped sharing as much in general. When we were with friends or family, he'd let me do most of the talking, like always, but now it felt different. He wasn't just stepping back to let me shine. It was like he didn't want to participate at all. He'd sit quietly, nodding along to the conversation, but there was a distance in his eyes that hadn't been there before. At home, he became more withdrawn. For years, I had taken James's patience and kindness for granted. I had always assumed that he didn't mind stepping back, that he was happy to let me take the spotlight. But now, for the first time, I started to wonder if maybe I had pushed him too far. Maybe he was tired of being overshadowed, tired of being the one who always gave while I took. That night with the cheese platter feels like a turning point. I thought I was just being playful, but now I see that it wasn't just about the cheese. It was about all the times I had shut him down, taken the credit, or made him feel like his contributions didn't matter. And for the first time, he let me see that it hurt him. I don't know where we go from here. I want to believe that we can get back to the way things were, but part of me wonders if I've done too much damage, if I've taken too much without realizing it. All I know is I miss the way he used to look at me, with warmth and admiration, like I was the best thing in his world. Now, when he looks at me, there's something else there. Something I don't want to admit might be resentment, and I don't know if I can live with that. I need help. I came here to vent, but if any of you can offer advice that could help me, I'd really appreciate it. Update. 2 months have passed since the cheese platter night, and I can't recognize my marriage anymore. It feels like James and I are living in 2 separate worlds, even though we still share the same house. He's here physically, but emotionally, he might as well be on the other side of the planet. I know it's my fault. In the weeks after that night, I told myself I was overthinking things. James had always been quiet and reserved, and I convinced myself that nothing had really changed. But now, looking at the state of things, I can't lie to myself anymore. Something inside James broke that night, and I was the one who broke it. He's still polite, still kind, just not to me, and there's a coldness to him that wasn't there before. It's like he's put up this invisible wall between us, and no matter what I say or do, I can't get past it. He doesn't talk to me unless absolutely necessary, and he always seems angry. He doesn't engage with people as much as before, and when he talks to me, he does so with the shortest sentences possible and avoids anything resembling a conversation. He used to look at me like I was the most important person in his world, but now when he looks at me, his eyes are empty, like he's looking right through me. Every day I wake up hoping things will go back to normal, but they don't. James has found ways to carve out his own life within the house. He spends most of his time in the garage working on who knows what. It's almost like a sanctuary for him now, a place where I can't follow. When I try to ask what he's working on, he just shrugs and says it's none of my business. I've tried to go out there to spend time with him, but he always finds an excuse to leave, saying he needs to grab something from the store or that he's tired and heading to bed early. Meals are the hardest. We used to eat dinner together every night, even if we were both tired or busy. It was our little ritual, a chance to catch up and connect. Now he eats quickly and excuses himself as soon as he's done. Sometimes he doesn't even sit at the table. He just grabs his plate and eats in the garage. I've started keeping track of the small moments, trying to find cracks in the wall he's built between us. Once I managed to make him laugh. It was just a small chuckle, almost like it slipped out before he could stop it. For a second, I felt a flicker of hope, but just as quickly, his face went blank again, and he muttered something about needing to finish a project. It's like he's determined not to let me in, no matter how hard I try. And then there are the nights. The nights are the worst. James still sleeps in our bed, but he stays as far away from me as possible. If I reach out to touch him, he shifts away, pretending to adjust the blanket or turn over. It feels like there's an invisible line down the middle of the bed, and crossing it would be breaking some unspoken rule. And I've started crying myself to sleep more often than not. I can't help it. The guilt is crushing, and the silence between us feels like it's suffocating me. I think about all the times I shut him down, all the moments I took away from him because I was too selfish to let him shine. I think about the way his face twisted that night when I made him the punchline of my joke, and it's like a knife in my chest. I've tried to apologize. I've tried to talk to him, to tell him that I see what I did wrong and that I want to fix it, but he doesn't seem to believe me. He listens quietly, nods when I speak, and then goes right back to shutting me out. It's like he's made up his mind about me, and no amount of apologies can change it. I miss him so much. I miss the way he used to light up when he was excited about something, the way he'd share his hobbies with me even when I didn't understand them. I miss the way he used to laugh, the way he used to look at me like I was the best thing that ever happened to him. Now I feel like a stranger in my own marriage. James doesn't laugh anymore, not around me at least. He doesn't share his hobbies or his thoughts or his feelings. He doesn't even look at me the same way. It's like I've been erased from his life, even though I'm still here. The house feels so quiet now. There's no more playful banter, no more shared moments of joy, just silence and distance. And it's all because I couldn't let him have his moment. I had to make it about me, to be the center of attention, even when it came at his expense. I keep asking myself how I let it get this far. How did I not see what I was doing to him? How did I not realize that every time I took the spotlight, I was dimming his light? Now, I don't know if there's anything left to save. James hasn't said he wants to leave, but I can feel it in the air, that heaviness, that tension, like he's just waiting for the right moment to say he's done. And honestly, I wouldn't blame him if he did. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I can fix this, or if I've already lost the one person who loved me unconditionally. All I know is that I would give anything to go back and do things differently, to let James have his moments instead of taking them for myself. But life doesn't work like that. I can't undo the damage I've done. All I can do is sit here in this quiet, broken house and hope that somehow, some way, James will find it in his heart to forgive me. But as the days go by, I feel that hope slipping further and further away. I messed up really, and I have to live with that. I don't know if there's any redemption for me or my marriage, but all I know is I won't find it here. So this will be my last post. Thank you all, and goodbye.